Give us your initial response to what we've heard from the government this morning. A request for a short delay is being sought from Brussels. Does that box you in once again to a binary choice between her deal and no deal?
Well, I'm really troubled by the suggestion that there's going to be only an application for a short extension. David Lidington, speaking from the government last week, said to seek a short extension if we haven't got the deal through by today, the 20th, would be, in his words, reckless. I can only assume that Prime Minister is going back to the only strategy she's ever had, which is to try and put her deal up against no deal and to just introduce a new cliff edge in 3 months' time. So
we're boxed in again with that choice. So no deal became more likely overnight, did it?
Well, again, David Lidington last week that he said if we go for a short extension, if we haven't got the deal through by today, it makes no deal more likely. His words, not mine. So the Prime Minister is doing something which her own deputy says is both reckless and makes no deal more likely. This, at the very moment when what we really need is true leadership and finding a way through the impasse by allowing Parliament to have a greater say. So it's the complete opposite, I think, of what most people in Parliament want to happen.
Theresa May clearly wants to bring her vote back if she can convince the Speaker. And we heard this morning from one Cabinet Minister, at least, if she thinks she can win, she could bring it back. What's your assessment of when that could happen? It could still happen next week, do you think? Well,
it could happen next week. There are two...
Are you ready for that? What would the Labour strategy be?
I mean, there's two preconditions that the Prime Minister herself has put on this. The first is that she's got to think she's going to win it. So she's got a lot of ground to make up in a short period of time. The second is she's got to persuade the Speaker that the deal, the proposition that she wants put on the table to be voted on is different to the deal that we voted on last week. And that's a tall order.
So which amendment would the Labour Party put forward, though, and what would the Labour Party strategy be? Would you back an amendment that called for a vote on her deal, Kyle Wilson, or would you back an amendment that asked for Parliament to have more say, something like Hilary Benn's amendment?
Well, there are two different, or at least two different issues in play. The first is an amendment similar to the one Hilary Benn put forward last week, which is really a process amendment that says Parliament needs to find a way to break the deadlock. Now, whether that's indicative votes or some other mechanism, I think there's a yearning in Parliament for MPs to be able to say, this is where the majority is, and we need to go from there. So I don't doubt that that will happen next week. The Kyle Wilson amendment, as it's been called, is an amendment to the meaningful vote. So that rather depends on whether the Prime Minister puts down a meaningful vote. That's on the deal itself and essentially says that if the deal gets through, it ought to be subject to the lock of a public vote. But that depends on actually whether the Prime Minister puts her deal down.
So if Hilary Benn's amendment was tabled once again, it only was narrowly defeated last time. Would there be time before April the 12th, another cliff edge deadline we're hearing about this morning, would there be time before that to get this indicative vote process through Parliament? What could happen in that time frame?
The indicative votes could happen before then. I mean, whether it's indicative votes or something else, I think what people want is a mechanism so that Parliament can say, of the now available options, where is the majority? And I think that Hilary Benn's lost by a very small margin last week. I think now MPs will say, for heaven's sake, we cannot have another 3 months of this my deal or no deal, which we've had for the last 2 years. That's a failed strategy. And so I think there will be this attempt to, as it were, take over the process and come to a decision across the House.
And Jeremy Corbyn met yesterday with members of the SNP and other parties who want to revoke Brexit. The Labour Party, though, I understand, wants a Labour version of Brexit. So can they find common ground? Because it didn't seem from yesterday that common ground was found.
Well, the point of those meetings is to bring people together to see what the priorities are and to see whether there's a way forward. It was the first of what will probably be a series of meetings, but what it demonstrates is that leadership on this issue has passed from the Prime Minister now to the opposition, because I think parties across Parliament are saying we need to find a way through. We need to break the impasse. And whether it's in Parliament, whether it's in the business community or whether it's more generally across the country, I think people are desperate for the impasse to be broken. That will only happen if we find a majority in Parliament and find a way forward.
And what is your understanding of the EU position? If Parliament does take control of the process somehow and another solution is sought, that is not going to be a quick thing to do, is it? That's going to involve another whole host of conversations and discussion, which could take a long time. Is your understanding that the EU would allow that? If the red lines change, that there would be a very different time horizon from the EU?
My understanding from discussions with those in Brussels is what they want, first and foremost, is to know what's the point, what's the purpose of any extension. There's no point talking about a length of extension until you know what you're trying to achieve in that extension. So I think they would actually be encouraging of a process that allowed us to answer the question, what is it you want to do with any extra time? Because until we get there, we are really going forward again without a purpose. So I don't know for sure, and I don't think they would try to dictate what our Parliament does next. But I think they might be relieved if they got an answer to the question, what's the purpose of the extension?
And if one of the amendments ends up in another referendum, if we end up in another referendum situation, what kind of questions should be on that paper, Keir? Should it be Remain and a Labour choice of Brexit and a Tory choice of Brexit? What should the question be?
Well, the question is going to have to be determined by Parliament. The Kyle Wilson amendment, as it's been named, simply goes on the proposition that the deal or any deal that gets through is subject to a lock of being confirmed. So you could have quite a simple question, which is whether you confirm the deal or not. And I would therefore argue that in those circumstances Remain would be the default. But in the end, the first question is there a majority for having another question of some sort put back to people to break the deadlock? If so, what that will be a question for Parliament.
And how would you and Jeremy Corbyn vote if the choice was between a Labour Brexit and Remain?
Well, I don't think a Labour Brexit, in a sense, can be on the ballot paper at this stage because you've got to have a negotiated deal. But I've always said that I would vote Remain in any further referendum, just as I voted Remain last time.
Do you think Jeremy Corbyn is happy to allow the UK to exit the European Union? Shukar Imuni, your previous former colleague in the Labour Party, has said that that's his perception.
Well, Jeremy can answer that for himself. He did vote Remain last time. He's been very clear and open about that. Of course, it will depend on the options, and Jeremy will no doubt be asked that question many times over, but for my part, I'm clear what I would do.
I mentioned Shukar Imuni, of course, he speaks for the independent group now. Some of your thoughts and policies, I guess, around Brexit, or your held views around Brexit seem to chime with some of theirs. Have you ever been tempted to join the independent group?
No, I'm not. I'm staying with the Labour Party. And that's where I'm carrying on my work, and that's very important because the Labour Party is, in my view, the only party that can be an effective opposition and the only party that can get into government as soon as possible to change the many things that need changing.